Night of June 5th, 1944. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the air still carried the thick scent of wet earth and diesel. Somewhere on a remote Pacific island, beyond the coral reef and just past dusk, 4 silhouettes crouched near a half-abandoned coconut plantation. The youngest, barely 20, checked his watch for what must have been the 10th time. 25 minutes, he whispered, voice low, almost devoured by the wind. The palm fronds swayed lazily above them, dripping the remnants of the earlier storm, and in the distance, faint beams of Japanese searchlights cut through the humid darkness, sweeping across the lagoon like ghostly fingers searching for intruders. Beyond that, the reef-lined beach shimmered pale under the waning moon, deceptively calm, almost inviting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Their objective was brutal in its simplicity. Let the enemy believe the landing zone was barely defended, allow them to pour in, and then annihilate them. A detachment of U.S. Marines, codenamed Black Fox, had been tasked with executing one of the most daring ambushes of the Pacific Campaign. They were to let approximately 900 Japanese soldiers believe they had the Marines surrounded and then, in 4 relentless hours, erase them from the island. The men in the shadows knew nothing of the grand strategy unfolding across oceans. They did not know about the massed fleets converging on Normandy that very night, nor the thousands of men readying for the largest invasion in history. Their orders came through a faint radio whisper, masked in static and coded poetry. The cicadas fade, and the night will carry our cry. That was the signal. It was time. Captain Jack Hawkeye Morrison, aged 43, crouched over the sand, his face half hidden beneath his Paris feathered helmet. Before the war, he had been a drill instructor in Paris Island, famous for a gaze so sharp it could cut through fear. He had seen death in too many forms, comrades falling in Tarawa, friends lost to malaria and mortar fire. Yet what burned in him now was not vengeance. It was duty, pure, unflinching duty. He adjusted the strap of his Thompson, glanced once at the horizon, and murmured, "We do this for freedom. For every man who didn't make it home." Beside him, Sergeant Luc Morel, a burly Cajun mechanic from New Orleans, wiped a streak of mud from his brow. His hands, though calloused and rough, handled explosives with the precision of a jeweler. He could fix anything from a jammed Browning to a broken spirit. To his right crouched Corporal André Vasseur, once a university student studying history in Montreal, who had traded his books for a rifle. He often joked that he had come to the islands to write history instead of reading it. But no one laughed tonight. And lastly, there was Private First Class Claire Lemoyne, their communications courier. Though her presence in a frontline combat detachment was unconventional, she had earned her place with courage and competence. The others had learned not to question it. They had exactly 25 minutes to set the bait. The plan was intricate: position decoy fires and abandoned rations near the shoreline, broadcast fake chatter in Japanese frequencies, hinting at retreat, and conceal the real Marine platoons in a semicircle of camouflaged foxholes further inland. When the Japanese assault landed confident, eager, and loud, they would be met with synchronized crossfire, pre-sighted mortars, and the wrath of men who had mastered patience. The 4 figures moved like shadows through the undergrowth. Every step was deliberate. Their boots sank softly into the wet soil, leaving no clear prints. The jungle smelled of salt, decay, and tension. A lone dog barked somewhere in Marnes. The distance once, twice, and then silence returned, abrupt and final. Morrison signalled with 2 fingers, and the squad split Morel and Vass to the east flank, Claire to the comms relay near the ridge, and Morrison himself toward the centre line. As the minutes melted away, the sounds of the island changed. The distant hum of crickets gave way to the rhythm of boots, faint, rhythmic, foreign. Through his binoculars, Morrison caught glimpses of figures moving by torchlight across the lagoon. Small boats, at least 30, gliding silently toward the beach. The Japanese were coming. He pressed the transmitter to his lips. "All units hold. he whispered. Await my mark. Remember, we're not the hunted tonight. We are the hunters. In a hidden trench 200 yards inland, the rest of Black Fox waited. 50 Marines, hunkered in the mud, rifles aimed toward the sea. They were veterans, men who had seen Saipan and Guadalcanal, men who no longer flinched at the sound of artillery. Some prayed. Others checked their magazines again and again. The air was thick, heavy, and electric with expectation. At exactly 20 minutes past midnight, the first Japanese mortar flare arced into the sky, bursting in a pale green glow that washed the beach in eerie light. Shouts followed orders in sharp syllables. The enemy believed the deception completely. They surged forward, hundreds of them, confident the Americans were retreating. The first line hit the sand, charging inland in perfect formation. Morrison raised his hand. Hold. Hold, he whispered through gritted teeth. His watch ticked loud in his ear. Then, as the first wave crossed the invisible perimeter marked by driftwood stakes, he dropped his hand and shouted, Now! The night exploded. Machine guns roared from the flanks, spitting tracers that carved fiery arcs through the darkness. Mortars thumped from the ridgeline, raining steel on the clustered Japanese ranks. The enemy faltered, stumbled, and then chaos swallowed them. The lagoon turned into a cauldron of fire and screams. Morrison's men moved like clockwork, each squad firing in overlapping arcs, every burst calculated, every explosion deliberate. Sergeant Morell's demolitions tore open the eastern approach, collapsing the palm grove where the second Japanese wave had taken cover. Corporal Vass coordinated the flank teams, his voice steady even as bullets hissed past. Claire relayed coded messages between positions, her fingers trembling only once when she heard the distant cry of a wounded Marine. The battle raged for hours, a blur of noise and fire. The Japanese tried 3 counterattacks, all repelled. They charged screaming, Banzai, but found only disciplined, patient resistance. By the 3rd hour, their numbers had thinned drastically. The field was littered with bodies, rifles half buried in mud, and the smell of cordite choking the wind. Morrison's men held firm, faces streaked with sweat and soot. At the dawn's first light, 4 hours after the first flare, the gunfire faded. The echoes lingered, rolling softly over the reef like distant thunder. Morrison stood slowly, his knees stiff, his eyes scanning the devastation. Smoke drifted lazily above the shattered trees. The once green field had turned black and crimson. Nearly 900 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying. Not a single one had escaped the perimeter. A medic moved among the Marines, checking pulses, binding wounds. Casualties? Morrison asked hoarsely. 17 wounded, sir, 2 dead. He nodded, saying nothing. His throat tightened not with grief, but with the quiet gravity of victory. Around him, men sat in silence, too exhausted to cheer. Sergeant Morell lit a cigarette with shaking hands. 4 hours, he murmured. 4 damn hours. Vass sank onto a rock, wiping blood from his helmet. They thought they had us surrounded, he said softly. Guess we surrounded them, instead. Morrison turned toward the horizon. The sun rose slowly over the Pacific, painting the clouds gold. He thought of all the other battles still to come, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and beyond. The war was far from over, but for this one dawn, on this nameless island, they had done the impossible. Claire approached, her radio slung over her shoulder. Command wants confirmation, she said. They asked if the area is secure. Morrison looked out over the silent beach, the empty waves lapping gently where so many had fallen. Tell them, he said quietly, the storm has passed. She nodded and keyed the transmitter. Black Fox to command, objective complete. The storm has passed. The static hummed in reply, then faded. The wind returned, rustling through the broken palms, carrying with it the faintest echo of last night's fury. Somewhere beyond the reef, the ocean breathed, timeless and indifferent. And for the men of Black Fox, the calm had returned earned, fragile and fleeting. The plan was deceptively simple in its cruelty toward the enemy's confidence. Beneath the faint glow of a red-filtered headlamp, Captain Jack Hawkeye Morrison unfolded a crumpled map across the damp earth. The ink had begun to run from humidity, but the lines were still clear enough for what mattered. "Bravo and Charlie platoons," he began, his voice calm but firm, "will lie concealed inside the coconut plantation and along the jungle fringe, facing north. Delta platoon will take position on the beach ridge. When the Japanese push inland, we'll let them believe they've surrounded us. Then, at hour 0, we'll strike from 3 sides, cut off their retreat, and finish them in the next 4 hours." His words carried no trace of hesitation, only the cold precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times before. He paused, scanning the faces of those gathered in the dim light. Each man's expression reflected a mix of tension and trust. "Luke and I will be the bait force," Morrison continued. "We'll take the fringe near the beach, close enough to draw them in, but not close enough to die for nothing. Vass, you'll handle the trigger charge on the defender's ammo dump. Claire, you stay high with the radio on the ridge. Keep communications clear, monitor their channels, and watch for any flanking boats or air support. If they spot us, don't hesitate. Warn us, then run. Do you understand?" Claire hesitated for only a second before asking softly, "And if they catch you?" Morrison met her gaze, his weathered eyes illuminated by the flickering lamplight. "Then you'll be the one to tell the world we tried." There was no bravado in his tone, just quiet acceptance. Claire's jaw tightened. She gave a single, resolute nod. Outside, the jungle hummed with the restless pulse of night. The air hung thick with salt and moisture, carrying faint hints of smoke from the Japanese encampment across the lagoon. The 4 of them, Morrison, Luke, Vass, and Claire, slipped silently into position, their movements synchronized through unspoken rhythm. The mud clung to their boots, muffling every step. The ocean murmured somewhere beyond the tree line, the waves whispering like distant voices. Morrison checked his wristwatch again, its cracked glass catching the faint light. 18 minutes to go, he murmured, almost to himself. From the ridge above, Claire adjusted the dial on her radio set, tuning through bursts of static until the frequency cleared. She could hear fragments of Japanese chatter officers laughing, soldiers trading jokes. She translated bits in her mind. "American cowards, all fled north, island secure. Tomorrow we drink to victory." She swallowed hard, fighting the chill crawling down her spine. Across the lagoon, the enemy camp flickered alive with lanterns. Dozens of soldiers lounged beneath makeshift tents, cleaning rifles, smoking, or warming rice over small fires. The rain had ended hours earlier, leaving the air dense and sticky. Laughter rolled across the water, carefree and confident. The Japanese believed they had swept the island clean of Allied presence. The decoy landing lights on the opposite shore had done their job perfectly. Exactly 25 minutes earlier, remote barges unmanned, lit only by false signal lamps, had begun skirting the reef. From the enemy's viewpoint, it looked like the beginning of another amphibious landing. In truth, it was theatre, a deadly performance to lure them into the kill zone. The Japanese had taken the bait, moving their forward companies to the beach, eager to crush what they assumed was a small, disorganized marine unit stranded on the southern side of the island. Now, the trap waited to close. Sergeant Luke Morrell crouched beside Morrison, checking his Thompson and muttering a low prayer in French. "If this works," he said, "it'll be quick. If it doesn't," Morrison replied without looking up, "it'll be quicker." Vass knelt a few yards away, his hands steady as he tightened the detonator clip for the buried explosives. The charge was wired directly to the Japanese ammo cache, a mountain of crates packed with mortar shells, grenades, and fuel drums that would ignite like a miniature volcano when triggered. His face glistened with sweat despite the cool night air. "Detonators live," he whispered. "Once they hit the perimeter, I'll wait for your mark, Captain." Morrison nodded, eyes on the tree line. "Good. Make it count." Claire's voice crackled faintly through the radio. Movement confirmed on the eastern approach. I count 4 boats crossing the lagoon, maybe 50 men total. More on the far side, waiting for signal. You've got about 15 minutes before contact." "Copy that," Morrison replied. "Stay sharp. If they flank, I want to know before they breathe." The night deepened. Clouds drifted over the moon, plunging the island into shadow. The jungle swayed softly in the breeze, whispering secrets through the leaves. Morrison crouched lower, watching through his field glasses as faint silhouettes began to emerge from the mist near the shoreline. "Here they come," Luke muttered. The Japanese soldiers moved cautiously at first, rifles raised, bayonets glinting faintly. Their officers barked hushed orders. Then, emboldened by the silence, they advanced more freely, believing the Americans had long fled. Morrison could almost hear their confidence in every careless footstep. He exhaled slowly, grounding his nerves. Behind them, deeper in the jungle, Bravo and Charlie platoons waited like coiled serpents. The Marines were dug in, rifles resting on sandbagged perimeters, mortars already pre-sighted on the approaches. Each man had his orders: hold fire until the signal flare burst. Then, unleash everything. Vass crouched beside the detonator wire, thumb hovering near the trigger. He glanced once toward Morrison, who gave a slow nod. "Not yet," Morrison whispered. "Let them come closer." 10 minutes passed. The enemy crept deeper into the kill zone. Lanterns swung at their waists, casting moving circles of light that danced across the palm trunks. The faint sound of laughter still carried men joking, unaware that death waited just beyond the tree line. Morrison could see their faces now. Some were barely older than his youngest recruit. Claire's voice came again, tense but controlled. "Captain, be advised 2 patrol boats approaching from the west. Small, armed. I can't confirm how many aboard." "Hold your position," Morrison said. "If they break the ridge line, call it out." "Understood." Luke's grip tightened around his weapon. "They're in range, sir." Morrison exhaled. Almost. A sudden noise cut through the night, a startled cry from one of the Japanese scouts who had found the abandoned marine gear left as bait: a canteen, a blood-stained bandage, and a single empty ration tin. The soldier called out in triumph, waving it overhead. Others crowded around, cheering. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "Now." The first flare shot into the air a brilliant streak of red that burst high above the coconut trees. For one breathless instant, time froze. Every face turned upward. Then the world erupted. Vass slammed his thumb onto the detonator. The Japanese ammo dump exploded in a blinding flash that tore the night apart. A shockwave rolled through the jungle, followed by thunderous roars of gunfire. From 3 directions, the concealed marine platoons opened fire in unison. Machine guns chattered, mortars thumped. Tracers streaked through the smoke like fiery comets. The Japanese ranks dissolved in chaos. Morrison and Luke stepped from the shadows, pouring controlled bursts into the confusion. "Push them back," Morrison shouted. "Cut off the beach!" Vass reloaded, smoke and debris swirling around him. The explosion's glow illuminated faces: fear, fury, disbelief. Claire's voice crackled faintly through the static. "Captain, air patrols scrambling from the far side. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they're overhead." "Then, we finish before that," Morrison answered, firing another burst. The smell of cordite and burning palm filled the air. The night that had begun with quiet rain now thundered with death. 4 hours from now, the reports would read that the Japanese were annihilated to the last man. But in this moment, in the second act of their grim theatre, there was only the raw rhythm of battle, the deafening exchange of fire, and the knowledge that the trap they had built with fear and patience had finally closed. Morrison's watch ticked past midnight. He raised his weapon once more, eyes blazing under the flicker of firelight. "Black Fox!" he roared into the chaos. "No retreat! No! Mercy end it here!" The trap had been sprung. At exactly midnight, Captain Jack Hawkeye Morrison stood in the darkness, rain-soaked helmet glinting faintly under the dim shimmer of the distant lagoon. His voice was low, steady, and calm. "Let them come," he whispered into the radio. The words rippled quietly through the hidden trenches, passed from man to man until every marine on the island held his breath. The trap was ready. The night, still moments before, seemed to lean closer, listening. No more than 5 minutes later, faint rustling rose beyond the ridge. The Japanese advance had begun soft at first, like the whisper of leaves brushed by wind. Then came the low murmur of boots, the clinking of bayonets, the steady rhythm of men trained for silent assault. Roughly 900 soldiers crept forward through the dense vegetation. Infantry, machine gun teams, mortar crews, and a few engineers burdened with satchels of explosives. They believed they were the hunters, closing in on a small pocket of trapped Americans. Their radio orders were curt and confident: circle around the ridge, trap the enemy, and destroy them before dawn. Morrison crouched behind a fallen palm, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He could see their shadows slipping across the open ground, black figures framed against the faint glow of their own flares. He raised his hand slightly, his pulse steady. Then he whispered into his handset, "They're in the kill zone. Delta engage on my mark." Seconds later, the night exploded. The first muzzle flash split the darkness, followed by a deafening roar as mortars erupted from concealed positions within the coconut plantation. Shells whistled overhead, exploding in orange plumes among the advancing ranks. The Japanese froze in shock, then scattered, shouting orders that dissolved into chaos. From the flanks, machine guns thundered, their tracers carving streaks of fire through the night. At Morrison's signal, Bravo and Charlie platoons opened up from their hidden trenches. Lines of fire crossed the battlefield in precise, deadly arcs. The enemy's formation shattered instantly. Some tried to turn back toward the shore, stumbling over their own fallen. Others pressed forward in panic straight into crossfire that chewed through palm trunks and men alike. Then came the blast. Corporal André Vasseur, crouched near the ridge, slammed the detonator. The Japanese ammunition dump erupted in a massive explosion that tore the night apart. A ball of fire rose high into the sky, turning night into day for a fleeting moment. The shockwave rolled through the jungle like a living thing, toppling trees, throwing men to the ground, and sending a hot gust of burning debris across the lagoon. Fuel drums ignited, mortar shells cooked off, and the enemy's communication lines went silent in an instant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. From her position on the ridge, Private Claire Lemoine gripped her radio headset tightly. Through the static came the sounds of screaming and gunfire. "Beach approach boats detected on the right flank," she shouted. 24 men, maybe more." Morrison's response was immediate. "Delta, reposition, swing right, give them hell." Delta platoon shifted along the ridge like a wave, their Browning machine guns roaring to life. The boats never made landfall. The sea turned white with bullets and blood as the assaulting troops were torn apart before reaching the sand. The survivors tried to turn back but were consumed by flames from the exploding fuel drums still burning behind them. The Japanese realized too late what had happened. The perimeter they thought they controlled was gone. Their 900-strong force had walked straight into the jaws of a perfect ambush. Now, trapped between fire and steel, they became the prey. The battle raged like a storm without mercy, the air filled with the screams of men, the sharp staccato of automatic fire, and the thunder of mortars. Smoke rolled across the field, thick and choking, illuminated by flashes of orange and red. Morrison ran from one position to another, shouting commands over the roar. "Hold the line, keep your intervals tight, watch your sectors." Sergeant Luc Morel appeared beside him, mud and blood streaked across his face. He handed Morrison a fresh magazine. "We've cut them in half, Captain. They're breaking toward the plantation." "Then don't let them through," Morrison shouted back, slamming the magazine into his Thompson. Together they pressed forward, firing short, controlled bursts. Across the battlefield, Vass crawled to a new vantage point, dragging a box of grenades behind him. He hurled one into a cluster of Japanese soldiers, attempting to regroup near a fallen palm. The explosion tore through them, scattering bodies like rag dolls. He ducked low, panting, and yelled into his radio, "Ammo dump's still cooking. They've lost their comms, no coordination left." Claire's voice came faintly through the static again. "Captain, additional movement near the east tree line looks like stragglers trying to flank your left." Morrison turned, spotting flickers of light in the jungle shadows. "Bravo! Sweep the left flank. Keep them off our backs," he ordered. The response came instantly, another volley of fire, more shouts, more bodies falling. The enemy's discipline began to collapse. Without clear orders, they charged wildly, some screaming, "Banzai!" as they rushed the Marine lines. The Americans held firm, their fire disciplined and deadly. Those who reached the trenches met bayonets and rifle butts. The clash of steel and the guttural grunts of close combat filled the humid air. Luke fought beside Morrison, swinging his rifle like a club as another attacker lunged from the smoke. He drove the butt into the man's chest, sending him sprawling, then finished him with a short burst. "They just keep coming," he shouted. "They won't for long," Morrison replied grimly, his eyes scanning the burning horizon. Minutes bled into hours. The tide of battle ebbed and surged, but the Marines never faltered. Every Japanese attempt to break out met a wall of bullets and fire. Each retreat path was already covered. The plantation became a maze of death palm trees shredded by gunfire, trenches overflowing with smoke and the acrid stench of cordite. By the second hour, the enemy had lost more than half their strength. The survivors huddled behind shattered tree trunks, firing blindly into the darkness. Morrison's men pressed the advantage, moving forward in pairs, covering each other's advance with precision honed by months of training. At one point, Morrison spotted a wounded Japanese officer crawling toward a discarded radio. Without an hesitation, he fired a single shot. The man slumped, lifeless. There would be no reinforcements. From her ridge post, Claire could see the entire island flickering with firelight. Her throat ached from shouting coordinates and warnings into the radio. Each report was shorter than the last, less enemy movement, less return fire. The battle was turning. By the third hour, the chaos had begun to fade. The screams grew fewer. The gunfire came in bursts, then in isolated shots, and then silence began to seep back through the smoke. The night that had once been alive with violence now pulsed only with the faint crackle of burning wood. Morrison moved through the aftermath, his boots squelching in the mud, his weapons still raised. Bodies lay everywhere, some twisted in impossible shapes, others half buried in the churned earth. He passed one of his own men, kneeling beside a fallen comrade, whispering a prayer. "Status?" Morrison asked hoarsely. Luke limped up beside him, wiping soot from his face. "We're holding. Lost a few good men, but the field's ours. Vass is checking the far ridge for stragglers. Claire's safe still relaying." Morrison nodded. His ears rang from the constant thunder of battle. "How long?" Luke checked his watch, cracked but still ticking. 3.5 hours since we started." Morrison exhaled slowly, the weight of it all sinking in. 3.5 hours of fire, smoke, and steel, and nearly 900 enemy soldiers wiped out to the last man. He looked toward the smouldering horizon, where dawn's first light was beginning to pierce through the haze. In the distance, the ocean shimmered like glass, reflecting the rising sun. The air smelled of salt and ashes. Morrison lowered his weapon, his voice barely audible. "They thought they had us surrounded," he murmured. "We just let them in." Luke glanced at him, silent. Then, slowly, he nodded. The two men stood among the wreckage as the first full rays of morning broke across the battlefield. Behind them, the surviving Marines began tending to the wounded, collecting weapons, and counting their own dead. The silence that followed was not peace, it was exhaustion. But for now, at least, the killing was done. By the second hour of the battle, the truth of the enemy's resilience became painfully clear. Though the Japanese ranks had been thinned, their ferocity had not. The once precise machine of their advance was now a chaotic mess of fire, fear, and desperate resolve. Yet, despite their crumbling command and fractured lines, they fought on with unnerving discipline. Around 400 of them, those who had managed to push deepest into the plantation's tangled interior, now found themselves completely isolated, trapped between the Marines' encircling positions and the unforgiving sea. They were cut off, leaderless, and doomed, though none among them yet realized the full scope of it. Morrison crouched in the shallow trench, mud smeared across his face, his radio pressed tightly to his ear. He spoke with quiet finality. "Now. Close the ring." The order went out like a spark along a fuse. Delta platoon, perched along the ridge, sprang from concealment and unleashed their fury. Mortar shells whistled through the canopy before crashing into the enemy's rear lines, scattering bodies and earth alike. From offshore, the destroyers' silent watchers, until now opened fire with chilling precision. Their shells slammed into pre-registered coordinates, erupting in orange blooms that shook the ground. Japanese machine gun nests, hastily dug into the open fields, were obliterated by overlapping sniper fire and mortar bursts that struck in eerie unison. The night became an inferno of noise and light. The air thickened with acrid smoke. The smell of burned palm fronds, wet earth, and gunpowder choked every breath. The rhythmic thud of bullets hitting sandbags and splintering wood created a grim symphony. Morrison, his ears ringing, pointed toward a ridge where faint movement flickered. "Flank left!" he shouted. "Drop grenades into that nest!" Luke Morrell led the charge, his squad moving low through the ferns. Muzzle flashes lit their faces in bursts of orange and white. Vass followed close behind with his demolition team, flamethrowers strapped to their backs, their nozzles gleaming like serpents in the firelight. The Marines advanced, methodical and merciless. Grenades arced through the air, detonating with concussive thumps that shook the very roots of the trees. Flames roared through the brush, igniting ammunition packs and turning the enemy's cover into a furnace. In the enemy's improvised command post, a crude cave dug into the plantation's fringe panic took hold. Japanese officers shouted frantically, their words drowned by explosions and the static of their failing radios. The cave walls trembled as mortar rounds landed dangerously close. Cell phones were non-existent, and their outdated equipment crackled helplessly. They tried to signal their navy for aid, shouting into dead frequencies. High on the ridge, Claire Lemoine sat with her radio, her face illuminated by the dull glow of her instruments. Her tone was calm, precise, and unwavering. "No incoming boats," she reported into the command channel. "They're contained. Repeat, no reinforcements inbound." Her fingers trembled only slightly as she adjusted her signal scrambler, ensuring the enemy's desperate transmissions were jammed beyond recovery. At 3.5 hours in, Morrison glanced down at his mud-streaked watch. The glass was cracked, the hands slick with grime, but it still ticked. He pressed the side button, clipping the time. 30 minutes to 0, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Then, louder, over the net. "Everyone, final sweep positions. They have no retreat. Finish it." His voice was raw but unyielding, the tone of a man who knew the line between victory and tragedy could still shift with one mistake. Across the battlefield, the Japanese lines began to crumble completely. Cut off from command, they fell back toward the beach, clutching their rifles, shouting orders that no one followed. But the exits were gone. Every boat launch point had been rigged with demolition charges, Vass's careful handiwork from the previous night. As the first desperate group reached the sand, the charges went off in a rolling series of concussive blasts. Fire and sand erupted skyward. The survivors stumbled backward into the gunfire waiting for them. The tide had turned. Confusion became panic. Panic became slaughter. Fire teams swept methodically through the burning plantation, clearing one pocket of resistance after another. Each squad moved with machine-like precision, covering arcs, advancing in short bursts, calling out enemy positions. The moon hung high now, pale and cold, washing the battlefield in a haunting silver light that reflected off shell casings and bodies alike. Over the radio came Morrison's steady command. Terminate resistance, protect the civilians, secure the beach, then extraction in 10 minutes. His words carried the weight of command, but also exhaustion, the weariness of a man who had seen too many nights like this one. The Marines advanced with silent determination. Weapon discipline was absolute. Every burst was measured, every movement deliberate. A lone Japanese squad, realizing the futility, raised white cloths in surrender. Morrison ordered them into a clearing to be secured as prisoners. They dropped their rifles and knelt silently under guard, their faces expressionless beneath the glare of flares drifting down from the sky. Elsewhere, pockets of resistance still clung to life. Some enemy soldiers fled deeper into the jungle, vanishing among the trees. But the Marines followed, relentless. The jungle itself seemed to close behind them with the sound of gunfire, screams, and the crackle of burning brush. As the final phase neared, time seemed to warp. Every minute felt stretched thin, every heartbeat amplified. Morrison crouched behind a shattered log, exchanging fire with the last pockets of resistance. The ground shook as another offshore salvo landed, tearing apart what remained of the Japanese defense line. He reloaded, his hands steady despite the chaos. "Push forward," he called. "No more stalling. End it." At exactly minute 4 of 4 hours, the enemy launched one final, desperate counterattack. Roughly 50 men surged from the smoke in a suicidal banzai charge, bayonets fixed, voices raised in a guttural roar. It was a last act of defiance, a doomed grasp for honor. Morrison's Marines met them with overwhelming firepower. Automatic rifles, machine guns, and mortars thundered together, cutting down the charge before it could close the distance. From the sea, the destroyers joined in once more, their shells obliterating what remained of the assault. And then, silence. At precisely 4 o'clock, the battlefield fell quiet. No more shouting, no more gunfire. Only the low crackle of burning wood and the distant hiss of the tide reclaiming the blood-stained sand. The trap had worked perfectly. 900 enemy soldiers, once so confident, so sure of victory, had been neutralized. Most were dead, a handful were captured, none had escaped. The ambush had been flawless, a grim testament to planning, courage, and the cold arithmetic of war. Morrison stood slowly, his legs trembling. His uniform was soaked through with sweat and mud, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. He lifted the radio to his mouth, voice barely above a whisper. "Black Fox, mission complete. Extracting now." There was a brief crackle, then Claire's voice came through, steady and clear despite the static. "Copy that, Captain. You're green for pickup. 5 minutes." Luke emerged from the haze, helmet dented, rifle slung over his shoulder. He dropped beside Morrison, panting heavily. "Sir," he said between breaths, "we did it." Morrison looked at him, his expression unreadable, the glow of distant fires reflected in his tired eyes. "We did what we had to," he replied softly. Then, after a long pause, he added, "For freedom." The two men sat in silence as the dawn began to rise over the shattered battlefield. Around them, medics moved among the wounded. Marines gathered what gear they could carry. The sea breeze carried away the smoke, revealing the scars of their victory, a landscape of craters, twisted steel, and still forms lying where they had fallen. Above them, the first extraction helicopters appeared, their blades thumping rhythmically against the quiet morning air. Claire's voice guided them in, calm as ever, like a beacon through the fading chaos. Morrison watched them descend, his mind heavy with everything the night had taken and everything it had spared. As the wind from the rotors swept across the beach, lifting ash and sand into the air, Morrison turned once more toward the horizon. The ocean gleamed under the newborn sun. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a breath that did not taste of smoke. It was over. The grinding hour had passed. As the first pale streaks of light broke over the horizon, the Pacific awoke in eerie silence. The reef shimmered faintly beneath the thinning mist, and beyond it, the grey silhouettes of U.S. transport ships could be seen crawling slowly toward the distant invasion beaches. Their engines rumbled softly, a deep mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo through the still air. Though their operation lay beyond this island's story, their presence marked the beginning of something far greater, a new phase of the war, written in blood and courage. The Marines of Black Fox stood amidst the wreckage they had created, surrounded by the silent evidence of the night's violence. The battlefield was a grim mosaic of bodies, shattered weapons, and the skeletal remains of burned-out vehicles. Japanese artillery pieces lay twisted and broken, half buried in the sand. The smell of gunpowder still lingered, mingled with the acrid tang of scorched foliage. A few crows circled overhead, drawn by the scent of smoke and death. The temperature was rising fast, and the first touch of sunlight glinted off the countless shell casings that littered the ground like dull brass coins. It was a scene of victory, but not of celebration, only exhaustion and disbelief. Captain Jack Hawkeye Morrison walked slowly through the ruin, his boots crunching softly over debris and empty magazines. His uniform was soaked with sweat and salt, torn in several places, but his stride was steady. He moved toward the edge of the beach, where Corporal André Vasseur sat on the sand, elbows resting on his knees, staring at a shell hole a few feet away. Inside it lay a young Japanese soldier, barely more than a boy, his face frozen in the blank stillness of death. Vass's voice trembled when he spoke. "I kept waiting to hear more gunfire, sir," he said quietly. "Waiting for another wave. I thought they'd come again." Morrison stood beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was low but firm, the kind that carried conviction even when it was tired. "It's over," he said. "The storm's past. You can stop waiting now." The younger man nodded slowly, though his eyes never left the fallen enemy. The sound of gentle surf filled the silence between them. From a short distance away, Claire Lemoine approached, her radio headset dangling loosely around her neck. She looked drained, her uniform streaked with mud and smoke, but her expression was calm. "Extraction is inbound," she reported. "We'll be gone in 10. Morrison gave a short nod, glancing toward the sea. "Copy that," he said simply. Luc Morel trudged toward them from the ridge, rifle slung across his back. He stopped to take in the view around them, the rows of dead coconut trees, the torn-up sand, the shattered craters filled with stagnant water. He kicked a spent cartridge with his boot, watching it spin into the dirt. "We let them surround us," he said after a long pause. "They thought they had us cornered, and we let them walk straight into hell." Morrison looked down at his watch. Its cracked face was smeared with grime, but the hands still pointed precisely to 4 hours past midnight. 4 hours, he murmured. 4. That's all it took. The words hung in the air like an epitaph. Around them, the surviving Marines began to regroup near the shoreline, gathering their weapons and tending to the wounded. The medics moved quietly, their expressions hollow. A few men whispered prayers under their breath. Others simply stared out at the ocean, letting the morning wind cool their faces. The smell of the sea began to replace the stench of gunfire, and somewhere in the distance, a gull cried a sound so normal it felt almost alien after the night they had endured. Within minutes, the growl of engines echoed across the lagoon as the first Higgins boats appeared, their hulls slicing through the calm water. The Marines filed aboard, one by one, stepping over wreckage and fallen comrades alike. Morrison was the last aboard. He turned once, gazing back at the beach where smoke still curled lazily from the ground. The island's palm trees, those that still stood, were silhouetted against the dawn, a jagged skyline of survival and ruin. As the landing craft pushed off from shore, the island began to shrink behind them, swallowed by the haze of rising heat. The operation they had just completed would never be officially acknowledged in dispatches. No press releases, no victory photographs, no medals pinned in public. The 900 Japanese soldiers who had stormed the plantation would write no propaganda, stories of triumph. Their force had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the silence of secrecy. To the outside world, this small island would remain just another nameless mark on a map. Back aboard the transport ship, the Marines were greeted not with cheers, but with quiet nods. The deck smelled of diesel and sea salt, a sharp contrast to the jungle's heavy rot. Men slumped against railings, weapons still in hand, faces hollow from exhaustion. A Navy chaplain moved among them, offering murmured blessings and a flask of water to those too weak to stand. When he reached Morrison, he paused. The captain sat on a crate, helmet resting on his knee, his eyes distant and unreadable. The chaplain handed him a folded sheet of paper, stamped with an official seal. "You're cleared, Captain," he said gently. "But mark this, what was done here at dawn will not be forgotten." Morrison took the paper, fingers tightening around it. He nodded once. "Sir." The chaplain moved on, and Morrison unfolded the note. It was a simple acknowledgement of mission success, written in precise military phrasing. No mention of sacrifice, no mention of the men they'd lost. Just coordinates, timings, and confirmation. Objective secured. He folded it again, slipped it into his pocket, and exhaled slowly. Around him, the Marines stood at the ship's railing, watching the island recede into the distance. The smoke that had blanketed it through the night was now thinning, replaced by a thin veil of morning mist. Claire leaned against the rail, her hair tousled by the wind, her headset finally switched off. Vass sat cross-legged on the deck beside her, head bowed, eyes closed. Luke stood nearby, scanning the horizon as though he could still see ghosts in the waves. Far out to sea, a small object bobbed against the current, a Japanese message buoy, painted red and white. It had been released sometime during the night, meant to signal reinforcements that would never come. The currents carried it gently toward the beach, where it would wash ashore and tell its silent tale of defeat. Morrison followed its slow drift with his eyes. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the larger invasion would begin at first light. The Marines' 4 hours of hell had bought precious time for ships to land, for men to move, for history to change course. It was a small victory, invisible to most, but it had mattered more than they would ever fully understand. The captain rested his hands on the railing, letting the sea wind wash over his face. The salt air stung his eyes and burned in his throat, but it felt clean pure in a way the battlefield never could. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull lull his thoughts. The world was quiet again, almost too quiet. Behind him, the engines rumbled louder, pushing the ship toward open water. Morrison looked back one final time. The island was now no more than a thin shadow against the golden edge of dawn. The sun had fully broken the horizon, casting a blinding reflection across the waves. He drew in a deep breath, the words barely escaping his lips. "We won freedom tonight," he said softly. "But we didn't win it easily." Claire turned to look at him, her expression solemn. "No one ever does, sir," she replied. The captain nodded, eyes fixed on the light spreading across the sea. The storm of the night had passed, leaving behind a silence so vast it felt sacred. In that silence, they carried not triumph, but remembrance, the weight of what had been lost, and the fragile peace they had bought with blood. As the transport ship disappeared into the horizon, the island faded into memory, leaving only the gentle roll of the ocean and the promise of another dawn. The year was 1964. The sun shimmered above the tranquil waters of the Pacific as Colonel Jack Hawkeye Morrison stood alone on the weathered pier. The wind carried a soft whisper from the palms, bending gently toward the sea as though bowing to memory itself. The island before him, once a cauldron of smoke, blood, and fire, was now unrecognizable, lush with wildflowers, dotted with small thatched huts, and filled with laughter from distant tourists. The landing ramps and gun emplacements were long gone, replaced by neat trails and quiet gardens. Where the command bunker once stood, there now stood a memorial simple, silver-grey stone, facing the morning tide. Morrison's boots echoed softly as he approached it. A bronze plaque was fastened to the stone. He knelt, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. It read, "In memory of those who gave their all on this reef, the 900 who surrounded the hunters, and the hunters who let them in." Below the inscription were 4 names: Luc Morel, André Vasseur, Claire Lemoyne, Jack Morrison. The letters were fading, smoothed by years of wind and rain, but to him each name still burned as bright as the day it was carved. He let his hand rest there, motionless, as memories surged like waves. He could almost hear Luc's voice again, hoarse, steady, urging the men forward, André's laughter before the storm, Claire's calm instructions crackling through the static of the field radio. The ghosts were close, not haunting but watching. Morrison stood, staring out toward the horizon. The reef shimmered pale beneath the shallows. He could still picture it as it had been 2 decades earlier, black with smoke, red with fire. He remembered the deafening roar of artillery, the flash of explosions, and the terrible quiet that followed when dawn finally came. He remembered 25 minutes of stillness, that perfect trap before the chaos erupted, and then 4 long, unrelenting hours of battle. Every second had burned itself into him, every loss still counted in the beat of his heart. André Vasseur had not lived to see the morning. He died beside the detonator clip, bleeding but unbowed, whispering the words, "Finish it." Morrison still carried the same clip in his coat pocket. He reached for it now, feeling its cold, worn metal edge. Luc Morel, the young lieutenant who had fought like 10 men, lived through the war, and later trained new recruits in Saigon until the early 1960s. Claire Lemoyne, the voice that once steadied them all through chaos, had returned home to France and spent her later years documenting the untold stories of the Pacific campaigns. She became a historian, teaching generations about courage, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. Morrison exhaled slowly. "You'd be proud, André," he murmured. "They still remember." From the distance came the hum of an approaching ferry, a small civilian transport from the mainland, painted bright white and blue. Its passengers were families, travelers, and schoolchildren on a field trip. They waved toward the shore, unaware that the grey-haired man in uniform standing there had once commanded men in battle on this very island. Morrison lifted his hand in return, a faint smile crossing his face. None of them knew about the night that changed everything. None of them smelled the acrid smoke, felt the ground tremble, or saw the skies lit with fire. And that was exactly how it should be. Peace was meant to erase those scars from the living, to leave only memory as the keeper. He turned his gaze toward the line where the sea met the sky. The same ocean breeze that once carried the scent of cordite now smelled of salt and freedom. The cries of gulls replaced the shouts of men. He thought of the promise they had made to hold the line, no matter the cost, so that others might never have to. That promise had been fulfilled. The island was free. The world had moved on. Behind him, a group of locals approached the memorial. A young woman placed a single white flower at its base. She looked at Morrison curiously, recognizing his uniform's faded ribbons but not the history they represented. He nodded to her, offering a gentle smile. She bowed in respect, then walked away. Morrison watched her go, his chest tightening with quiet pride. He took one final look at the plaque and read the words once more. The 900 who surrounded them, the hunters who let them in, the battle that lasted 4 hours but lived forever in silence. He could still hear the echoes, rifles cracking through the dark, shouted orders, the crash of waves against burning wreckage. Those sounds would never truly fade. They were part of him. He whispered softly, almost to himself, 25 minutes set the trap, 4 hours sealed it. His voice trembled slightly, then steadied. Because of them, freedom passed this shore. The sun broke higher over the horizon now, painting the sea in gold and rose. Morrison straightened his back, saluted the memorial, and turned toward the pier. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet filled with peace. The mission that had begun in darkness had ended in light. What they had done here would never appear in history books, never in parades or medals, but it had mattered. It had saved lives, shaped victories, and carved out a fragile piece that had lasted for decades. As he reached the end of the pier, he paused once more. A faint glint caught his eye in the sand, a rusted cartridge case, half buried, polished by tide and time. He bent down and picked it up, turning it in his fingers. For a long moment, he stared at it in silence, then slipped it into his pocket beside Andre's detonator clip. Two relics of a night when courage met destiny. A gentle gust rippled across the water, carrying with it the scent of salt and the echo of the past. Morrison closed his eyes. In that instant, he could almost hear them again, boots thudding softly on wet sand, whispered commands in the dark, the sharp crack of rifles, the deep rumble of explosions rolling over the reef. Then, as the waves broke softly along the shore, the sounds faded once more into silence. He opened his eyes. The island lay still and calm, bathed in morning light. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the village. The war was long over, the years had been kind, and peace had finally claimed the ground they once fought to hold. Morrison whispered his final words into the wind, his voice carried away over the sea. "We won freedom that night, but we didn't win it easily." Then he turned, walking slowly toward the waiting ferry. Behind him, the island stood silent, its reef gleaming like a promise kept. The dawn stretched wide and endless, and the world, at last, was quiet. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.